Welcome to this lecture sponsored by the Institute of World Politics. For those of you who are new to us, IWP is the Graduate School of National Security, Intelligence, and International Affairs. We offer doctoral and PhD programs, 8 master's degrees, two of which are online, 18 certificates of graduate study. If you're interested in learning more about us, please see a staff member after the event or visit us at iwp.edu. We would like to thank all of our supporters who make our events possible. And to support IWP, please visit iwp.edu/donate. Today we will be hearing from Professor Glenn Corn in a lecture entitled "The War in Ukraine, an Update from the Front." Professor Corn is a faculty member here at IWP and a 34-year veteran of the U.S. Intelligence and Foreign Affairs communities. He has served for over 20 years abroad, including tours in Russia, Turkey, Central Asia, South Asia, and the Middle East. He has also held senior leadership positions within the intelligence community in the U.S. and is a graduate of multiple specialized training programs in the field of intelligence, security, adult education, and training and executive leadership. He is the founding partner of the Strategic Advisory and Consulting Forum, Great South Bay, and an expert contributor to the Cipher Brief. Professor Corn has a master's degree in Russian language and literature from American University and a bachelor's degree in Russian studies from Hofstra University. He is also a graduate of the U.S. Army Russian Institute. He speaks Russian and Turkish, and as a faculty member at IWP, he teaches a course on Soviet and Russian intelligence and security services, as well as Turkish foreign policy and intelligence. With that, please join me in welcoming Glenn Corn.
Thank you. Thanks. Hello, everybody. Is that working? I'm going to pull that out. Thank you for the introduction. It's great to be here. I am very thankful to IWP. Hi, how are you? For letting me teach here and interact with the students here who are amazing. So some of them are in the room, and for everybody, anyone that's a sponsor or a supporter of IWP, I cannot say enough positive about this institution. And I always like to start out by thanking Dr. John Lenchowski, who helped me get to the place where I am teaching here after I retired from the CIA, and it's a great honor. And again, the students here are just quite wonderful. I'm going to be talking to you today. This is kind of a continuation of some talks I've given in the past. When I first retired from the agency, I started traveling to Ukraine in the summer of 2023. So I've made, I think it's about 10 trips now. And I just came back from a trip recently in the beginning of February. We were there for about 10 days. And when I come back, I always offer to IWP and other organizations in town here, and actually around the country, to speak about this topic because I think it's so important. And what I've seen since my career in the agency, there's a lot of disinformation out there in the information space. There's a lot of misunderstanding. There's a lot of confusion. And there's, of course, a lot of deliberately placed disinformation, my own assessment, by the Russian government and through their proxies, to try and influence U.S. political thinking and decision-making, which is nothing new for what the Soviet Union did to us for, since 1917, and it's a continuation of that. I talk about that with my students in my class. You're also, by the way, anytime you want to come sit in on a class, 6:30 at night we start, we finish up at 9:30, but you have to bring the coffee, all right, because I have to stay live. Now, I have to apologize right now because I do not like to stand behind the podium, and I like to move around a little bit. And we called this a lecture. I'd say it's more of a discussion because I hope for participation. I already had somebody approach me before and say they want to argue with me during the discussion. I love that because there are a lot of different views that have to be discussed, and this is a super complex topic, which I think sometimes in the United States we try and do everything, black, white. And we give a very cursory look at issues that go back hundreds and hundreds of years, are super complex, super nuanced, and the more opinions people want to share, great. The more discussion you want to have, great. I do have to say that some people accuse me. I put something on. Anybody here use LinkedIn? Anyone here not use LinkedIn? So I put something on LinkedIn after our last trip to Ukraine. I have a podcast that's called the Restricted Handling Podcast that I do with a partner of mine, friend of mine out on the West Coast. And when I was in Kiev this time, we interviewed an officer from Ukraine's Third Corps, which is probably one of the most effective combat units in the Ukrainian Armed Forces today. And it's a fascinating unit because almost the entire command staff before February 24, 2022, they were all civilians. None of them were professional military personnel. None of them went to military academy. None of them were in the Ukrainian Armed Forces. They were civilians, and they answered the call to come defend their country. And I interviewed one of the commanders of one of the drone units. And his call sign is Phil, right? And he's just an inspiring guy because he was living abroad in a very nice place with his family in February of 2022 when Russia expanded its invasion of his country. And he left everything to come home and fight. And he's been fighting. The first time I met him was last year in the summer on the front line at his command bunker about 8 miles from Russian positions. And this is where the guy lives. And so we had a great discussion. I encourage you guys all, by the way, sign up. Are you signed up for the Restricted Handling Podcast? You should be. There's a tough audience. You guys an audience or a jury? I don't know. Whoa. I've seen lively oil paintings. Come on. No. So I did this interview with him, and we did the interview. You guys probably know right now Ukraine is going through one of the most miserable, coldest winters they've had in a long time. And the Russians have been aggressively brutalizing the energy infrastructure of the country. So in Kiev itself, there are many districts without energy, or they're on rationed energy, 2 hours of electricity a day, buildings freezing, people living in apartments with no heat for now weeks on end, no hot water, elderly walking 16 flights of stairs to get up, to go down, to go shopping, often in the dark. Maybe if they were lucky, they have a cell phone or a flashlight, and then walking 16 flights back up. And I was in this building kind of in one of the remote regions of the city doing this podcast. We rented a little studio, and I was with this commander and some tech folks from his unit that were doing the shooting. And halfway through the podcast, the electricity went dead. We lost all power. And we sat in the dark for about 3 minutes, and then the lights came back on, and the tech guy said, oh, unfortunately, we lost all the tape. So about 45 minutes of interview. So they said, is it okay if we restart? I said, of course, I am good. How about you, Phil? You just came from the front to talk to me. You're going back. And he just smiled. He said, whatever you need, sir. And then I looked at the crew. I said, how about you guys? And they said, listen, this is Kiev right now. We're used to it. We're not going to surrender. And let's start again. And that's what we did. And that's the kind of attitude I kept seeing with Ukrainians, right? So I put something on, very resilient, and I put something on LinkedIn, and somebody came back and said to me in LinkedIn, stop romanticizing the Ukrainians and what's going on there, right? It's a lot more complicated than this romanticism, and I agree with that. There's definitely, but I have to say I'm a romantic at heart. Ask my wife. Okay, that was a joke. You got to laugh for me, okay? It was funny. Thank you. Thank you. So a friend of mine said if you have to tell people you're funny, that you're not funny. So I'm sorry. But I do kind of romanticize this issue a little bit, and I'm not objective, and I have to say that. All right? I lived in Russia. I worked in Russia. I actually, you heard, I started studying Russian when I was 16 years old. I had a very special place in my life for Russia, Russian studies. And I have to say sometimes in the United States when, people want to act that, you hear people say Russians are this, Russians are that. I don't think we should do that. As I said, there's a lot of complications in the relationship between Russia and Ukraine that go back hundreds of years. But when I see what's happening in Ukraine today, I have to say my own assessment is that Russia is wrong. Russia is the aggressor. I saw no indication in the build-up to this war, both in 2014 and then after, that the United States, NATO, or Ukraine was going to invade Russia. I am unaware of any plans, and by the way, I was in the government then, of any plans to do that. And I do not ascribe to the view that all Ukrainians are fascists and Nazis. I think that's a gross exaggeration. Do they have a problem in Ukraine? Yes, like in any country. And does Russia have a problem with ultranationalism, fascism? Yes, they do, right? But it was not the Ukrainians that launched an invasion of Russia, it was the opposite. And when I deal with the Ukrainians, and you hear some of the stories of the Ukrainians and what they went through, what they've been going through, and yet their willingness to continue fighting. And we're sitting here now, if you remember back in December, there were people saying that the Ukrainians should make a deal immediately because the front was going to collapse, right? Now the Ukrainians just took about 200 square kilometers of their territory back in Zaporozhye Oblast, near Gulyak-Polye. Okay, so is it a brutal war? Yes. Is it a horrible war? Yes. And by the way, do the Ukrainians want this war to end? Yes. And in my heart, I believe many Russians want it to end too. It's just the political structure in Russia does not want it to end, and we can talk about that. Not yet. Now, again, I have to say, like my caveats are, I am a little bit biased here, and everything I say today, I encourage all of you to go back and look at, think critically about, test it, study it. I could be wrong. You may have come up with a different conclusion, so don't take what I say as being gospel. It's just my view and what I've seen, and it's a little bit emotion involved here. All right, so this is not, as an intelligence officer, we were taught never fall in love with your target. But on this subject, I'm a little bit in love with the Ukrainians right now, I'm not going to lie, because they have been pretty heroic and pretty inspiring. And people say to me all the time, why do you go to Ukraine? It's dangerous, this time's cold. And I tell them all the time, it's inspiring as an American. And I think there's something in Ukraine today that stirs something in me as an American that I grew up believing in, that my parents raised me to believe in, and that we should stand for. And it goes back to our own history of being brave, courageous, resilient, and committed to defending our sovereignty and our independence and our values, right? And so that's why I go back and forth to Ukraine. This photo right here, I was just telling one of our guests, I took this picture last summer. I was in Kiev. I took it on, it's in an alleyway on one of the main streets in the walking district. Anybody here been to Kiev? Right, so it's downtown. And I was struck by this graffiti because if you notice, it's a Soviet soldier, and it's, with the, this is the lentichka, what do we call it, the band, the Georgivskaya lentichka, that they commemorated the veterans of the Second World War, the Great Patriotic War. And when I studied in the Soviet Union in the 1980s, and when I worked in Russia later, anybody that was a veteran of that war, anybody that had gone through that horrible war, was venerated and respected, and they should be. But what I've seen in Ukraine since 2014, and now especially since 2022, is, in my own opinion, Vladimir Putin is disrespecting the memory of the people that fought against fascism, because he is behaving in a manner that is very fascist, and it's horrible, and it's brutal. So I took that picture. My own interpretation is some young Ukrainian is saying basically someone is denigrating or desecrating the memory of the veterans, which is horrible to see. Now, I got that right? Okay, where's Shannon? I got it right? This is my disclosure I put on there. Anything I say today, I am a former U.S. government official. I am not anymore. I'm not associated with U.S. government anymore. Anything I say is my personal opinion. I should say, too, it's not IWP's opinion. Hopefully, it's close in thinking, but I'm speaking on my own behalf, okay? So I have to put that disclosure up there. Okay, so I just want to go through some statistics, right? Some numbers I came up with. By the way, I did this presentation as I was flying back from Ukraine. So if it's a little shaky, it's because the plane was turbulent. And I was on a British Airlines flight. And by the way, if you don't put your stuff away before, like they tell when they come, they're going to feed you on British Airways, you're in big trouble. Right? It's like my mother as a kid, the wooden spoon. Okay? So these are the estimated casualties going back to February. This is just February 2022. So we hear these numbers a lot, about 1 million plus Russian casualties. All right? 1 million, 2 million, 3. Some of the numbers that we heard from the Ukrainian military when we were there last time, the general staff, was that there are about 700,000 Russians that are directly involved in fighting in Ukraine right now, or directly supporting the war from Russia. Okay, that's about half the Russian armed forces. Again, about 1.2 to 1.4 million casualties. In December of 2025, I was in Ukraine in December. The number the Ukrainians gave us was the Russians had lost 35,000 casualties. Now, casualties, I have to say this too, it's very interesting. Earlier, it was probably about 3 wounded to 1 dead. That number has shifted because of all the use of FPV drones. And I was talking to somebody the other day in Kiev, and they were saying now on the front line, it's much more likely you're going to get killed than you're going to get wounded. Or if you get wounded because of the drone activity, at any given time along the front, there are hundreds of drones in the air from the Russian side, the Ukrainian side, most of them armed. They're hunting for targets. You can't, the depth or the width of the no man's land is in some places 40 kilometers deep, which means you can't you can't drive a vehicle into that space because it's probably going to get blown up. And many of you probably watch on YouTube some of the videos of what's happening. Someone tries to drive a vehicle down a road, the Russians try and get an armored column in, and next thing you know, 3 or 4 of the vehicles are destroyed immediately. A lot of wounded. But what that means is, and think about this, if you're wounded, it may take them days to get you out of that kill zone. And so the number of people that are dying now is much higher than it was before the rate. And the Russians lost 35,000 casualties in December. In January, another 30,000. And I think Ukrainians said the estimate for this month is probably going to be between 30 and 35. Because the Russians are losing troops at a very high rate. Now, I always say this, people say, 1 million casualties since 2022. Right? And we all heard recently in January, mid-January, that was the war has lasted longer than the Great Patriotic War, Operation Barbarossa, when the Germans invaded the Soviet Union. Right? Say, how can the Russians sustain this? And I always remind them, during the First World War, just in one battle on the Western Front for the Russians, for the Russian Empire against the Austro-Hungarian Empire, they had 1 million casualties. Okay, this is a country that's used to high numbers of casualties. Those of you that have taken my class, we talk about the suffering that the Russians have been through throughout their history. So it's really, for us, it's a very high number. Maybe for the Russians, it's not as high. Okay? But it is still pretty startling. This is all the equipment that the Russians, I'm not going to read it all out to you. You can look at it for yourselves. But this is all the equipment that the Russians have lost since February of 2022. It's an enormous amount of equipment that has been destroyed by the Ukrainians, disabled by the Ukrainians. This is in a town outside of Odessa. Pretty much in every town now or city you see this. The Ukrainians have lined up some of the destroyed equipment as like a monument or a display. And this is just one little city in the south. Again, near Odessa, not Odessa itself. All right, but you can look at all the artillery systems, multiple launch rocket systems, anti-aircraft systems that have been destroyed. Okay, just here alone, armor fighting vehicles, almost 25,000. Anybody here produce armor vehicles? Anyone know the number, like how much it costs to build one? That's a lot of money. Yes, sir.
Just for context, at the beginning of 2022, they had about 3,500 active duty main battle tanks, just to put that number in context.
Okay, yeah. Now the Russians are still trying to produce new stuff. And what we've heard in many cases, they're pulling stuff out. They had, one of the things they did after the collapse of the Soviet Union, they put a lot of stuff in storage. And we've heard cases where they may have even been going to museums and pulling stuff out, right? I don't know if that's true or not. Maybe it's a little bit of exaggeration, but definitely they are now deploying stuff which is very old and probably they never expected to, or they didn't want to have to use on the battlefield. And it's because the Ukrainians have stood up. Let's all remember that in February of 2022, I had to say this, is my opinion, but nobody in this town got it right. Everyone thought the Ukrainians were going to collapse. Putin didn't get it right. His intelligence services didn't get it right. They assessed that they were going to take Kiev, in 3 to 5 days, and probably all of central and eastern Ukraine. And we'll see the map of where they are right now, but it's not that. Okay? So they haven't made that progress. This is the aircraft they've lost, vehicles, naval vessels. This, by the way, I think is very significant because the Ukrainians have been able to push the Russians out of Sevastopol, pretty much make them ineffective, and drive them to the other end of the Black Sea and open up some of the lines of communication for trade and for shipping activity. And they've done that all without really a navy, like a manned navy. They're doing it with drones, right? With maritime, unmanned maritime vehicles and UAVs. And I'm going to keep going back to this because the nature of warfare, for those of you that don't know, it has changed completely in Ukraine. All right? It is unbelievable what's happening on both sides. And I warn audiences about this all the time. The Russians are learning a lot on the battlefield. For those Americans here, or for our Belgian colleagues,
Thank you for mentioning it.
I love that country. I love the people of Belgium.
Who doesn't?
I don't like the beer. They don't have good beer in Belgium, or chocolate. Them's fighting words. No, seriously, we are probably nowhere near ready to fight in the conditions that the Ukrainians are fighting in right now, and the Russians. And we have to remember that. And by the way, 50,000 North Korean troops are being trained and prepared on the battlefield there, mainly in the Kursk region. All right? Okay, territorial gains. In a nutshell, the Russians, they did not take all of Ukraine. They didn't take all of central Ukraine. They didn't take Kiev. I was just there. There's no Russian control of Kiev, right? They have taken a lot of territory, so about 20% of Ukrainian territory since 2014. But the price they're paying to take territory from the Ukrainians is pretty high in terms of both equipment and personnel. Okay, it's pretty high. And this is a statistic I got both from the Ukrainians, and then I did a little research on my own. Between 78 to 87 casualties on the Russian side for every square kilometer of territory that they have taken. So that's a pretty high number, right? And I think this is significant because what we're beginning to see, by the way, we'll go back to this, the number of casualties in December and January. Some of the statistics are now that the Russians can't recruit enough and deploy enough recruits fast enough to meet the losses. So they've only been able in January and December to bring 20,000 new troops. So there's a 10,000 troop deficit, let's say, in their staffing on the front lines. And one Russian analyst who I listened to 2 days ago speaking about this said it probably the Russians would need 300,000 more troops to achieve their objectives, which they stated for this year, which is to take all of the Donbass. Okay, yes, sir.
Is that because Putin continues to avoid mobilizing city centers to not upset Russian elites, or is that also now part of the problem?
It's a very great question. One of the things that the Russians did, Putin has been trying to avoid like the mobilization since 2022, which was very unpopular, right? The assessment is that he doesn't want to go to St. Petersburg, Moscow to touch the elite, because the last time they did that, many people fled. There are Russians living all over the world now in exile, right? So he's been looking for other ways to do it. One of the ways he's done it is foreign fighters. So we talk about the North Koreans. There have been other foreign fighters, Africans, Central Asians, got fighters from the Caucasus that have been recruited. We've heard stories about Serbians, Bulgarians, Latin Americans, right? And then they've been paying people, right? And actually the pay is, and the incentives is pretty high compared to what you can make in the civilian economy in Russia. That has been working up till now. And one of the things the Ukrainians tell us is actually the quality of Russian troops may have gotten better because in the last year, because what they're doing is they're going to people, because the economy is so broken, we're going to get to that, is in such crisis, there are people that are in debt, and they're going to them saying, we will write off your debt if you go join the military. Another thing they're doing is they're telling, okay, you join the military, you can fly a drone, you don't have to go to the front, okay? They sign up, and then guess where they are? On the front, okay? And there are many stories of Russian troops being sent to the front. The number we got last September from the Ukrainians is the Russians they were capturing, the POWs, were telling them that they were recruited, so signed up and deployed to the front in less than 7 days. Okay, they were given minimal training. They were sent to the front, given a weapon, and told, go that way. And what is happening because of that kill zone, that 30 to 40 kilometer dead zone, whatever we want to call it, what they're doing is they're sending small teams, 1 or 2 troops, and they're saying infiltrate behind Ukrainian lines. Okay, just try and get a position in a building, hunker down, and then try and cause problems for the Ukrainians. And we're going to try and get more reinforcements. All right. The other thing we heard that the last time we were there is one of the things they're doing is they're sending troops into a village. You talk about Pokrovsk, the fighting in Pokrovsk, right, Kupiansk, all these areas. in the Donbass, this fortified region, they're sending troops in with a cell phone and a flag, and they're saying, take a picture and send it back and say that we've captured that territory, because one of the assessments that the Ukrainians has, and they claim that's based on information they have, is that the Russians are then using that in negotiations, saying we control this territory. All right? And of course, I think they're using it for psychological warfare and basically to influence us here in the States and in Europe to think the Ukrainians have lost all this territory. It's hopeless. That's my assessment, right? So, the loss rate for the Russians, 17% higher than it was in the Soviet-Afghan war. We know that the Soviet-Afghan war eventually played a role in the collapse of the Soviet Union. It wasn't the only factor, but it became a very unpopular war, right? So it had a very negative impact on the Soviet Union towards the end of the Soviet Union. Okay, deaths outnumbered births in Russia in 2024, falling fertility rates and the shrinking population now estimated around 144 million, down from 147 million in 2021. Russia has a demographic problem, all right? There's a demographic decline. And I would suggest that this war is a long-term problem for Russia, which Putin has to pay attention to, and we have to pay attention to for many reasons, which we can talk about at the end of the discussion. All right? These are just some UN projections that Russia's population could drop to 57 million by 2100, a loss of over half its population in a single lifetime. All right? And during Ukrainian counteroffensive operations in mid-February, the Ukrainians have recaptured about 200 square kilometers of their territory. That fighting is still going on. By the way, these numbers, my understanding is these numbers are coming from Russian sources. The Ukrainians are not talking about what they're doing. They have information discipline. This is mainly coming from assessments like in great organizations here like ISW, right? A lot of the open source analysts doing great work. And some of the Russian mill bloggers are talking about towns and areas that they're losing, right? And we have to jump here for a second too and mention that Starlink recently cut off access to unlicensed Starlink along the front, which meant it's been it's been a big problem for the Russians because they've been using these unlicensed, unregistered Starlink terminals, and now their command and control has been negatively impacted. And my own assessment here is that the Ukrainians very smartly took advantage of that. So they're striking while the iron's hot to do some of these counteroffensive. They're not mass counteroffensive operations, but they are very targeted and very well done, very disciplined operations. And they're taking some territory back. All right? Yeah, so to accomplish Moscow's stated objective of capturing all of the Donbass by the end of this year, this is one Russian analyst said this. They would need to mobilize and deploy another 300,000 troops, which goes back to your question, sir, how is that going to impact the Russian population and socially what's going on inside of Russia? You're going to see one of my assessments is I think the Russians have done a very good job of convincing people in the West that they are in a much better position than they really are. And that has had impact on our thinking and on the thinking maybe in NATO about like how we should deal with this issue. But my own assessment is Russia is in much more trouble and having many more problems than many people realize. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about the economy too. But this is basically a map of the progress they've made, right? Some of the Ukrainians that we spoke with, and by the way, the Ukrainians, these are officials, right? Different organizations in the Ukrainian government. We're very fortunate that we get to speak with them. They claim that the Russians still have plans to take all of Ukraine, and that they're also talking about operations into the Baltics, which, by the way, is NATO. All right? So, that's their stated goals. Although one Ukrainian general told me, he said, remember that every year they come up with their stated goals, they never meet those goals. They haven't met them since 2022, but they keep presenting all these unrealistic goals. Okay? Again, this is what they call the fortified belt. You probably hear about this a lot in the media here. If you follow the Ukraine issue, there's a lot of fighting here, and it's tough fighting. And the Ukrainians that are coming from these combat zones say it is very, very tough, and the Russians are very effective in some of the things they're doing. They've been very good in the FPV drone space, and the drone space, one of the advantages they have, they're now producing more than the Ukrainians, although the Ukrainians said this year their goal to create drones, 7 million. How many is the United States producing right now? The world's greatest economy. The Ukrainians are working. We had the opportunity to visit one of their drone manufacturers, and it was like something out of, I can't even describe it, hundreds of people working. Hundreds of people working, putting together these drones, like working away. And I asked one of the workers, because it seemed like tedious work. And I said, how is it to work a shift here? He says, better than being on the front. So, by the way, if you guys have any questions or comments, please raise them as we go along. Okay, these are Ukrainian personnel losses. I put this little star here because the Ukrainians have been very careful not to talk about their losses. So this is estimates. And by the way, that million number too, million plus, those are estimates. The Russians don't admit that. So that's not an official Russian number. And I would say there's a lot of disinformation in the information space, not just from the Russian side. Everybody's playing a little bit in that disinformation space. So that's why I say you should try and scrub these numbers and take a look at them. This is just the estimate on the number of killed in action on the Ukrainian side. Obviously for Ukraine, which was a much smaller military to begin with and has a smaller population, this is painful. And one of the things is not in debate, and the Ukrainians admit this, is that they have a shortage of personnel. They have a challenge staffing their units. This is important. Civilian victims of the Russian aggression, 15,000 dead. Okay, documented deaths of children. All right, almost 2,000 wounded children, and then 2,000 to 3,500 Ukrainian children who are missing, kidnapped or abducted. Yes?
Yeah, so you mentioned, so you mentioned that, the cars earlier in the presentation about the cars being blown up. Do the people who are injured automatically become POWs, or what happens to them?
It depends. Sometimes they're recovered. One of the things that, I'm talking on the Ukrainian side, the Ukrainians have developed these UGVs, unmanned ground vehicles. They're ambulances that are going up to the front. They give the coordinates of the wounded guy, the wounded soldier, and then this unmanned vehicle will go pick them up. I got to tell you this great story. One of the Ukrainian commanders told me this story. He said because they're short of personnel, and because of the nature of that line of that kill zone, there are not like units, companies of troops in one spot. There are 2 or 3 soldiers in a dugout. Pretty much everything is underground now because of the air threat. And he had one guy who was kind of by himself in one spot along the front line, and they couldn't get him out of. They couldn't get somebody to replace him because of the challenges they were having. And they kept promising him, next week we're going to get you out of there. Next week. So he said finally he called the guy on the radio and he said, listen, the guy that was supposed to show up here, the replenishment, didn't show up. And so I'm going to have to ask you to stay another week. And this young Ukrainian soldier told him, sir, stop worrying. Just send me 3 things: Red Bull, Marlboros, and a hot dog. And he said we put it on a drone and we flew it out to him, and he got his hot dog, his Red Bull, and his cigarettes. And he held his position, right? Kind of funny story, but that's like resilience. Yes, sir.
So I've heard many different numbers in terms of Ukrainian children that have been kidnapped. Do you have a best estimate?
I don't have a best estimate. I would say that it's way too large that it should be. 1 child kidnapped is unacceptable. It is a major problem. And the number of war crimes, I'll show you a picture here. When we were in Kharkiv in September, we met with the war crime investigator for the Ministry of Internal Affairs. He took us to his office, and it was a room maybe like this in the basement of a building, and there are stacks of files of war crimes that they're investigating right now. Okay, and he gave us some very specific examples, and it's pretty terrible, right? In terms of the children, I think it's a large number. There have been some exchanges. I think the Russians handed some over. The First Lady appealed to President Putin, and he responded, which was great. By the way, that made her very popular with a lot of Ukrainians, as we say in Arabic, mashallah. But there are still too many that are being held, all right? The Ukrainians have a problem, obviously, about almost 4 million internally displaced Ukrainians because of the war, that they have to absorb that. 6 to 7 million people have fled the country. So all over Europe, some in the United States, other places, they're living abroad. They don't want to go back and fight. It's kind of a sad story. I met one Ukrainian whose son So he sent his son to Europe when his son was 14, and he can't bring his son back now because he's mobilization age. He doesn't want to get him mobilized, right? And then cases of, AWOL. So the Ukrainians have a problem here, soldiers deserting. One of the things they're looking at now is how to address that. And is there a way to reinduct some of these troops and get them back into the fight to address some of the concerns that they had that forced them to leave in the first place? But it's not like the Ukrainians have a challenge, staffing the military, for sure. Now, I have to say, I was talking about this with somebody the other day, and they got this American, and he said, I'm not opposed to going to Ukraine to fight, but I have to know what the mission is and like what the objective is. And I said, son, no Ukrainians ever asked you to go. And every time I've been there, the Ukrainians never ask us to send our troops to fight. They've never asked. I have 2 sons. They've never said, send your sons. They've never asked. Well, okay, they probably wouldn't ask me because I'm too old and blind to see anything. So that was a joke, but you're not laughing. But they're not asking us to go fight. I say this all the time. What they're asking for is our help with ammunition, right? Especially right now, they have a serious shortage of air defense equipment and munitions, and the Russians are taking advantage of that by overwhelming their air defense systems. That's one of the reasons why they've been so effective in the last couple of months, I say going back to November, December, in hammering the Ukrainian energy grid, which is causing a big problem for the Ukrainians. And so President Zelensky is regularly asking for assistance. I think this is a big challenge. My own assessment is that we have a challenge here because, by the way, I should have said this when we started. Tonight, as we're sitting here, we have U.S. troops deployed all over the Middle East, right? And we should all say a prayer for them because they are definitely on the front line now of a potential conflict, which could be ugly. And for those Americans and their families and those allies that are with us, I encourage all of us to just think about them, right? But that's an area that requires a lot of air defense. We've seen the Iranians, what they did in the last year in terms of launches against Israel and some other countries in the Gulf. It's not just Israel that we have to help protect. We also have to help our Gulf partners, right? We have bases all over the region, in Turkey, in Qatar, we're Bahrain. So of course we have naval vessels all over, and then U.S. business interests in the region and allied interests. So anyway, my point is, I don't know that we have, and this is the mistake we made after the end of the Cold War. We did not invest in our defense industrial complex, and we've had a challenge, and the Europeans have had a challenge catching up to what the Russians have been able to do in terms of production, right? Okay, I call this slide, how do you terrorize Ukraine? Okay, this is the infamous Shahed drone. They were originally designed and produced in Iran, and in the beginning of the war, the Iranians were selling them to the Russians. Now the Russians are producing them themselves in Russia, in Tatarstan, I think is the main production facility. In 2025, the Russians launched approximately 54,000 Shahed drones at Ukraine, all right? 175 to 180 launches per day in the fall, summer of 2025. And in one day, they had over 800 attacks in one single day launched against. And if you're in Ukraine, what happens is the sirens go off, the air alarms go off, and we'll be downtown, and you'll just hear the anti-aircraft fire going, boom, 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 and you'll hear, and if you're lucky, you'll hear, and you'll look up in the sky and you'll see black smoke, right? A lot of the damage you see is when the Ukrainians shoot something down and the debris falls on a housing complex or vehicles. Yes, sir.
Yeah, so there's okay. So two things. So you indicated, at least here, that the U.S. hasn't invested in weaponry. Military reports from a few years ago, at least, said the U.S. was not prepared for a conflict in Taiwan, especially if the Chinese were to blockade, as they've indicated through military exercises. So, given that, what would be the possibility of, if we could, provide air defenses in Ukraine? And then, secondly, given the current status of negotiations from some of the talks a few days ago, what do you think happens next in the region?
Well, let's save that question for the end.
Yeah.
For your first question, I didn't say that we provide a lot of assistance to the Ukrainians.
I'm talking about like air.
We provide a lot of air defense systems. We provide a lot of support. The Patriot systems, right? We've done a lot, okay? And our European allies have done a lot, right? And in the last year and a half, the Europeans have done a lot more. So the Ukrainians are getting assistance, but what they're saying is we need more because the Russians are attacking us more, right? And the Russians have some assistance from countries like Iran. I would suggest PRC, okay? So what I like to call the axis of evil, all right? That group, I've been saying from the beginning of all this, that Russians are not alone. And we need to stop thinking that we can just fight one problem at another. And by the way, I say this all the time too to American audiences. And I would suggest the same, maybe the Europeans are beginning to see this as well. We're at war, okay? Most Americans don't want to admit that. They don't want to think about it. And I don't want to think about it either. I spent my whole life trying to avoid this. But I think we're at war. And it's a new type of war. It's a very dangerous war. But we're at war. We can't expect to live the way we were living in 1994 or 1997. Things have changed. And we just need to wake up to it and accept it and step up like Americans have done over and over again in our history. But we can't be in denial. Right now, we've also begun our defense production. If 2 years ago, the numbers we were hearing from the Ukrainians, for every artillery round, 155 millimeter artillery round, for every 15 to 20 the Russians had, the Ukrainians had 1. That number has changed. I think it's now 3-to-1 ratio in favor of the Russians. Production's happening. All right, anyone that's in the defense space, you'll know there's all kinds of production happening. So there's been a response, but it hasn't caught up to the requirement yet, in my assessment. So we just got to keep working on it. And on air defense systems, what I'm saying is there are also requirements that we have to meet beyond Ukraine. And I always remind the Ukrainians, like, for you guys, we get it. You're the center of the world right now. But we have the Asia-Pacific region. We have the Middle East. We have the Western Hemisphere, right? We can't just say that we're going to give everything to one region or one theater. And that's the challenge that we have. And that's why I would suggest too, we need really good allies. So, okay, sorry, we'll go back to this here too. But the cost, $50,000 to $70,000 to produce a Shahed. So this is what the Russians are launching, and that's what it's costing them. It's not free, right? You just don't build a Shahed for free. That's what they're spending on this war. Ballistic missiles. The Russians have really been hammering the Ukrainians with ballistic missiles. In some cases on the energy infrastructure, what the Russians have started to do is they'll launch a number of drones, okay, to try and distract the air defense or deplete the air defense, and then they'll hit it with 2 or 3, maybe even 4 ballistic missiles to make sure that the target is hit and destroyed. All right? The Kinjal hypersonic missile costs about $4.5 to $15 billion to produce. I couldn't get a straight answer from the internet. If anyone knows, if anyone's producing Kinjals, let me know what the right number is. But it's pretty expensive. Caliber missiles, they've launched 335. They're 2 to 2.5 billion. That probably should be million per missile. And then the Oreshnik. There's been 2 fired since 2024. These are the ones that can carry a nuclear warhead. I was in Ukraine in December, and the Ukrainians were, I have to say that they're usually pretty brave when the air alarm, like the sirens go off. I was in Odessa back in February with some Ukrainians, and we're walking down the street on a Sunday, and all the air alarms go off. And I'm with this big Ukrainian guy. He's a colonel in the Ukrainian army. So I looked at him and I said, hey, Yegor, like, what should we do? Should we go to the bunker? No, what should we do? He goes, drink beer. So we went to an Irish pub. Very cavalier, right? Because they're just like used to this all the time. But I will say that in December when I was there, there was reporting that the Russians were going to launch an Oreshnik. The Ukrainians told us, get to a bunker. All right? Like, that is a very dangerous weapon system. They've only launched 2 so far from my research, but $30 million per missile to produce. That's a lot of money. All right? Propaganda budget, people. Okay? Propaganda budget. $1.64 billion for the budget for 2025 for propaganda information. That's mass media inside of Russia and outside, international. Mass media. That includes both official, so we all know Russia Today, Sputnik, their own TV channels inside of Russia, news channels. That also includes the budget for the intelligence services, who have, we all know, for many years, by the way, it goes back before the creation of the Soviet Union, to Tsarist times, been very effective and aggressive at using disinformation operations, fabrications, forgeries, whisper campaigns. So they're spending a lot of money. Online and social media, of course, this is a big area. If you're in the disinformation space, this has boomed in the last 15, 20 years, right? 13% increase in their budget in 25, so from 24 to 25, 13% increase in their information budget, and probably we're expected to increase in 2026 again, all right? So they're spending a lot of money on information warfare, and we need to think about that, okay? This is the Russian economy. I'm not going to read all the numbers, but the bottom line is almost all the experts, including experts in Russia now, are saying that Russia is in serious problem economically. They're having serious problems. Okay, they have a growing deficit. Their national welfare fund is running out of money because they've been spending so much money to buy Kinzhals, buy drones, build drones, pay troops to fight, pay the families, because one of the things they were doing is saying, okay, if you send your son to fight and he dies, you get a car, you get a washing machine. And that we laugh about that, but when you've ever been out to rural Russia, it ain't easy, okay? Life is not easy. And some parents have been saying, son, go, right? So, but they're running out of money to pay those salaries now, those benefits. Yes, sir? I didn't say that because you were laughing, although you were kind of laughing.
Yeah, I did.
Yeah. But you didn't laugh at my joke, so that's...
Thank you. So here it says decline defense spending for Russia. And I've seen that in my own research, but I did also see that despite this decline in defense spending, they've actually increased defense spending for their operations in the regions of Ukraine that they're trying to take more of. How do you think that will translate into their policy, their foreign policy, and their potential success in Ukraine moving forward?
I think that it's a great question. They've been forced to cut back on some of their defense spending, but they are definitely, they've shown like they are resilient in trying to achieve their objectives at the cost of a lot of lives. As I said, like those numbers, are those casualties are happening on that front line that we're talking about, right? They are spending a lot of money to try and achieve their strategic objective, what Vladimir Putin wants to achieve. How do I think it's going to play out? I think that if we and the Europeans continue to support the Ukrainians, that the Ukrainians will hold on. There's no sign that the Ukrainians are ready to surrender. My story about like being in that freezing cold building when the lights went out, what I want to say is I don't hear the Ukrainians saying, let's give up, like this is just too much. I think the Russians want that, but the Ukraine, it's having the opposite effect. One of the things the Russian information operations have been very focused on doing is trying to split the Ukrainians regionally. And historically that's happened. Like there's been resentment among the, in the east, the west, central Ukraine. Many of the Ukrainians I speak to now, whether you're from Kharkiv, whether you're from Lviv, whether you're from Kiev, just Odessa, they're saying we're more unified now than ever because we're angry. All right? Now, the Ukrainians, I think they know they can't fight forever. They want this war to end. And they've shown a willingness to make concessions. Right now, what we're waiting to see, and we're jumping back to your question about where this is going to go, are the Russians going to make some concessions? Because my own assessment is you can't have negotiations if only one side gets what it wants, right? The Ukrainians are not going to go for that. If the government today makes the agreement that Putin, Medinsky and others have been proposing, Lavrov have been proposing, if Zelensky puts his name to an agreement like that, it will not stick. The Ukrainians themselves will not accept it. Okay, the armed forces will not accept it. And I tell a lot of anecdotes, but when I was there in December, our driver, the little guy's name is, I won't say his name because I think we're on C-SPAN, but great guy, all right? He's an NCO in the Army. He's actually out now. So we hired him to drive us around. We were in one of the regional cities in the east. And he said to me one day, he said, Glenn, how can anyone propose that we surrender what we haven't lost in the Donbass? My friends have died defending that. There are Ukrainian lives that were like bloodshed. You can never, I will never accept that. If the president, the government here sells us out, we'll never accept it. So we have to remember that. And many Ukrainians will tell us too, they know like one of the things Putin wants is to be able to dictate to Kiev how the government is run, who the president is, or what the political structure is, right? And Ukrainians say, when we've done that in the past, it never ended well for those of us that believed in our sovereignty and in our culture. And one guy told me, he's a general in the army, he said, I have two choices. I can fight to the death with a stick if we run out of ammunition and weapons, if you stop supplying us, or I can die in a basement with a bullet put in the back of my head. Because that's what the Russians will do to many of us when they take back over our country. And I'd rather die on the front with the stick in my hand. So, is it romantic? Yes. But do I believe it's true? Yes. Because they have a very, very ugly history. Yes? 5 minutes, okay. So, I got to rush through this. This is just where we're at. Labor shortages throughout Russia, food prices raising sharply, consumer confidence at its lowest in 3 years. We all know that the oil and gas revenue is down. Okay, it's declining. This is a big problem for Russia. I think now with the additional pressure we're putting on India and the agreement now we have with the Indians, I think that will probably put more pressure. All right, the government revenue is dropping. And I put this example here. This is Akuyu nuclear power plant. I don't know if anyone tracks this issue, but it's in Turkey. The Russians are building, Rosatom has been building this nuclear power plant in Turkey, which is a whole other topic we should talk about sometime. But my understanding is, based on some of my friends in Turkey, that the Russians are in arrears for a lot of money to Turkish companies that have been building that. They can't pay for the work they're doing because the budget is being focused on that front line, supplying the front line to continue to wage that war, and on buying the missiles to continue to try and terrorize the Ukrainians. Okay? So again, I have to rush through this. By the way, look at the 1% of the GDP is in liquid assets. China is benefiting from this war. And many people say it, and I agree with it. The Chinese are buying up Russia bit by bit. Okay, this war is an advantage for the People's Republic of China. I'm not sure it's an advantage for Russia, in my personal opinion. All right? Liquidity declining. Banks are failing. Social stability. Did this when Putin came to power in the late 90s, early 2000s, what he offered the Russians was, I'm going to bring back dignity and our place in the world. I'm going to bring back stability. Anyone that lived in Russia in the 90s knows it was a very, very chaotic time. And you can understand why Russians wanted some stability and a change. But I would suggest that this war is actually bringing the opposite now. My own assessment is up until 2014, Putin gets credit for bringing Russia back off its feet, or off its knees, and giving it a status in the world. But then I think he overplayed his hand. And just if you look at some of the crime statistics, we know that the Russians have been recruiting actively convicts, murderers, people with very criminal records. They're going to the front, and if they survive, they're coming back, and they're going back, and in many cases, they're committing crimes back at home, often violent crimes. The number of cases of veterans that are committing violent crimes against other Russian citizens is pretty high, right? Some of the stories are pretty terrible. So I don't think this is answering issues of social stability or for Russia in the long term. All right, these are just some of the pictures of the energy infrastructure that was defined. This picture right here I like because, look, folks, what I see with the Ukrainians, as I said, many of the people that I deal with, they were not warriors. They were not fighters. They were IT specialists. One guy's a CISO in a bank. One guy was a banker. One guy I deal with, he was the head of the SEC of Ukraine. We were in a meeting with one unit, and we're talking. I asked one of the guys, I said, what did you do before the war? He said, I was the prime minister. And now he's in uniform, and they're fighting. This, people, is the tradition of the United States, the Minuteman. Okay, when the call came, we put down the plow, we picked up the rifle, and we went to defend our independence, or fight for our independence. This is a Ukrainian soldier, same story. So for me, that goes to the romanticism piece. These Ukrainians are doing something for their country which is pretty significant, my opinion. All right, these are some buildings in Kharkiv that were destroyed. This building here, you can't see it, but I found this very ironic. This was bombed out. It was a cafe. And it says in Russian, come in and have coffee with us. Okay, the Russians claim they're liberating or saving the Russians in Ukraine, and yet they're bombing the cafes of the Russians. And we all know that the population in Kharkiv is a lot of Russian speakers and ethnic Russians. Many of them have died at the hands of a country that says that they're there to liberate them. Okay, this was recently in Kiev. This is, actually it's in the center of the city. This is down in Mikhailivsk in the port. You can see this is where a cruise missile hit. This is also in the east. This is a building that was bombed out. This is one of the Ukrainians we know. This right here is a little graffiti on a building in Mikhailivsk in the city center that was hit early in the war. And it says Budemo Žiti, which means in Ukrainian, we will live. All right? There's a mother and her child. Look at the building back here. This is the dead of winter. All right? And I'm going to leave it like this last one. This poster is on the wall out here. And I say this to audiences all the time. Americans will always fight for liberty. The Ukrainians are fighting for their liberty. Nothing more. I'm telling you, they have no aspirations of invading, well, maybe some Ukrainians do, but I don't think that their plan is to invade the Kremlin or take all of Russia. And I don't think as Americans we want that. I don't know anybody. I don't think in Belgium people want that, right? They just want to defend their liberty, their country, their sovereignty. Okay? And I want to play this video. Okay, how do I do it? Where's Shannon? One more click? These are Ukrainian troops. And I like this little video because they're trying to live their life, trying to have fun in the middle of all this. And the guys that made this said, we're just trying to show people we're not surrendering. Like and we're not going to let this make us miserable. Anyway, I'm not going to waste all your time with that video, but the smiles on the faces of people, despite everything they've been through, that is resilience. That's another lesson that we in this country need to learn, in my opinion. I told you, I was in Kiev, like there's no elevators in 17, 20-story buildings. Grandmothers are walking up and down. Children are walking up and down. I came back, I took my wife somewhere here in DC, we were on an elevator. It got like stuck, it delayed on like the second floor for, I don't know, 2 minutes. And 3 people in the elevator said, I'm gonna sue the hotel, I'm gonna file a complaint. Like, oh my God. I was like, people, look, it can be worse, all right? We could be a little more resilient, my personal opinion. Okay. Any questions? Happy to answer them. I don't know how many time we have, but really I appreciate everybody being here. So, questions?
So, fellow agency guy that just came out.
Well, welcome to, it's kind of scary out in the general population.
So far, sorry, yeah. So one question, I guess, looking at this is, one of the reasons I jumped out of the agency was to try to go to the legislature and stop the erosion of American legitimacy. What's the opinion on the ground of the Ukrainians about American intelligence services and the whiplash they've experienced between administrations?
In terms of the intelligence service, I think the Ukrainians are very thankful for whatever assistance we've provided, like, partnerships. I will speak, I'm not going to talk about like the intelligence services. I want to talk about generally, the Ukrainians in the last year have been a little concerned that we're going to leave them. We're going to turn our back on them. I think some of that is promoted, I don't want to get into this too much here, but some of that's promoted by elements here in the States and in Europe, which are also exaggerating some things, because there's still a lot of assistance and there's a lot of support. And as I said, I did an interview on a Ukrainian news program, and the moderator asked me, like, do you think the United States is true? Like, you've abandoned us and you're not doing it. I said, no, that's really not true. Look at what's happening. The same day that we were doing that interview, we just signed a strategic agreement with Azerbaijan. That is Russia's backyard, and it's unheard of. 10 years ago, 5 years ago, nobody would have seen that coming, right? We're doing things, the agreement with India, like the tariff agreement, we put pressure on the Indians to stop importing Russian oil, right? We've done a lot, and we're doing a lot. The way we're doing it is not the way it's traditionally done, which I would suggest this administration is doing things a lot different than other previous administrations have been doing, but I wouldn't necessarily say it's all bad. Some of it is really good, in my opinion, right? In terms of like their relationship with us, they're very thankful. They understand the concept 2 years ago. What we kept hearing, like Americans telling him is like, we're not going to do another forever war. Like we've been through that. Those of you that remember 9/11 and then Afghanistan, Iraq, and I used to say to audiences all the time, like I understand, because I'd be in Texas, Ohio, Kansas talking about this issue, and people would say, like, we don't want another forever war. We don't want to just spend a lot of money and for like a cause like this without knowing what the end result's going to be, what's the objective. And I would tell people, I understand that. I'm like, I agree with you. I don't want that either. The Ukrainians understand that we don't want that. But again, the Ukrainians are not asking us to send troops. They really want our moral support, and they want to know that we're going to be with them and that we understand that they are the victims here. They're not the aggressors. All right? They did not start this war. Whatever the propaganda line coming out of the Kremlin, it's not true. Okay? So I hope I probably didn't answer your question, but welcome, and it's a noble thing to do, to like try and change things. Keep up the fight. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Could you please give us a 30-second or 1-minute assessment of Marco Rubio's speech in Germany?
You can look at
in
my
relation to Ukraine.
You can look on my LinkedIn. I said that was an outstanding piece of diplomacy. I personally was inspired by it. I think we have a very, very strong Secretary of State right now and head of the NSC. I think the points he hit were very fair and they resonated with me. Okay, some of the, like, especially some of the things he said, pretty much everything he said I agree with. So I think most Europeans, I hope the message that was clear, like we're not abandoning Europe. We are with Europe. And as he said, like we are descendants of Europe, we're children of Europe. We want to be with the Europeans. But when we have differences, if we don't agree, that doesn't mean it's the end of an alliance, which some people want to make it sound like it is. And I think many Americans, I try to say this to our European friends all the time, many Americans are frustrated with the relationship and different aspects of the relationship, right? And so the administration has a right to express that frustration. This administration, when the President Trump was in office the first time, he made it clear, stop buying Russian oil and gas. Don't make deals with people you say that we want to help defend. And in my own assessment, our European partners ignored them, right? They continued to do it. They thought they knew better. And then we had February 22, everyone kind of comes around, okay, like increase defense spending, all right? That's been a very strong message from his first term. It's happening now, which is great. And I think sometimes now we're on the other side. We don't give the Europeans enough credit, right? But I thought Marco Rubio's speech was great. So as an American, I was proud to see that that is our Secretary of State.
We're at time. We can take one more question.
One more question.
Thank you. Thank you for all this. I guess to cap it off, like, how would you respond to those that say that this war is not an existential to the U.S. or Europe, or existential threat? Will often point towards, slow walking certain resources despite the size of those resources over time, or the slow process of rearmament and et cetera throughout NATO is evidence that we don't really believe our own rhetoric of it being an existential threat. So how would you respond to those critiques or voices?
So my own assessment is it is an existential threat to the United States. If the Ukrainians, okay, first of all, we were with the Ukrainians. If we turn our backs now, we walk away, that will send a very, very bad message to a lot of people. And I say this all the time. In my career, so I was in the business after 9/11. And I'm very proud of the work we did, and I'm very proud to have been part of a lot of operations to stop terrorist threats around the world, including in this country, okay? Targets in this country. But we didn't do it alone. We did it with partners. We had to have partners that trusted us and knew that we also would take care of them when they had something they needed. All right, that's what like partnerships are built on. We need to send the message that we are with the Ukrainians. Doesn't mean we give them everything they want, but we're not going to turn our backs on them, okay? Because if we do that now, I think we're going to send a message to a lot of other countries that the United States can't be counted on. And by the way, the Russians are promoting that actively. They want that. They want countries to have like no faith in us. They want people to think that we've abandoned our values. And I personally think we can't do that. It's an existential threat for many, many reasons, right? So, are the Russians going to invade the United States tomorrow? No, I don't think so, right? I think that's not going to happen. Not militarily, like not conventionally, but we do have also a war of ideas going on right now, which is also an existential threat to our country and our values. And Ukraine is where that war is being fought right now in many ways, and then in our own country. I wrote an article 2 years ago when I retired saying the war for Ukraine is in the United States information space. And if we lose that war, we're going to lose a lot of other wars. And we shouldn't forget that if we surrender to the Russians now, or we try to appease Moscow now, that will send a very bad message to a lot of other people that think like Putin and that want to make a land grab. And then are we going to be able to deal with all that? I don't think so. And finally, I will say this, my own opinion is the President of the United States today has the opportunity to go down in history as the president who stopped Putin in his tracks. That Ronald Reagan did that to the Soviet Union, and I was around. Luckily, I was probably 3 years old then. No, I was actually, yeah, I know, Maggie. I started my career then, and it was like amazing to see what we could do, right? Because, and the goal wasn't to destroy the Soviet Union, the goal was to stand up for our values and with our allies and our interests. And when we did that, the Soviet Union collapsed on itself. President Trump right now has an incredible opportunity to stand up to Putin. My guess is Putin is horrified at the idea that the president will sign Lindsey Graham's sanctions packet, the new sanctions, or that he'll do something else. My own assessment is Putin overplayed his hand again in October, and President Trump then enacted sanctions on Lukoil and on Gazprom, right? That caused the Russians problems. So they have to be very, very aware that President Trump is in a position of strength right now, and Putin is not. Putin wants us to think he's in a position of strength. He is not in a position of strength. And the final thing I'd say is President Trump also has the ability that, like Ronald Reagan was very, very good. They called him the great communicator for a reason. He was very good at communicating with the people of the Soviet Union. And it was brilliant what he did, because he said, I'm not the enemy. We're not the enemy. We want to get along with you. President Trump in his first term, that was his message to the Russians. And many Russians like him, because they say, we don't want animosity with the United States. We just want to have some kind of relationship. President Trump now can say, I've given President Putin over a year to make a deal. And I put pressure on the Ukrainians to make a deal. I've given you an opportunity. For the Russian people, they need to know it wasn't me that didn't make the deal. And it wasn't President Zelensky that wasn't ready to make some concessions. It's your president and your leadership that has failed you. My personal opinion. Okay. I guess no other questions, no more time. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
I'd like to thank Professor Glenn Corn and our sponsors and all of you who joined us today. For those of you interested in learning more about our courses and applying to study at IWP, please again speak with a member of our staff or visit our website at iwp.edu. Again, thank you for coming tonight, and one more round of applause for Professor Corn.
Thank you, everybody.